Welcome to the Religious Treehouse. I'm Matthew.
And I'm Jody.
Oh, I am excited for our episode today. It should be good. How are you doing, Jody?
I'm doing great. You can't tell, but I'm wearing pajama pants, and that's my favorite thing to be doing. How are you?
I'm wearing jeans, but I'm happy with it. I'm doing great. We're in baseball season. It's spring training right now, so I'm excited for it. It's a good time to be in America because of baseball. So that's what we're focusing on, baseball season, and I'm excited for it. But today we are talking about Esther, but more specifically, the celebration of Purim, the Jewish holiday, and I'm excited for it. It's heavily rooted in the book of Esther. So I figure, do you want to give us a brief summary of Esther before we get into it a little deeper?
Oh, sure. Okay. So, if you guys don't know the story of Esther, the story opens with the king getting rid of his current queen because she wouldn't listen to him. And then he held a girly pop pageant. And at this girly pop pageant, there was this girl, Esther, whose uncle Mordecai had told her, like, you should go for the pageant. But, like, don't tell them you're a Jew. And so Esther went into the pageant. She won. She became queen. And the thing is, at the same time, this guy Haman was not vibing with Mordecai and was like, I want Mordecai dead because he won't bend the knee to me. So Haman went to the king and said, you should sign an edict to kill all the Jews. And Mordecai found out that this had gone out and he was like, oh no, what shall we do? Esther, I know I told you don't say anything about being a Jew, but you need to save all of us. So girly pop Esther was like, I must be brave and go to the king when you can't go to the king unless you're summoned to the king. So she went to the king and was like, hey, can you come to my place for like a little party? And she threw, was it two parties before she finally said something? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so but she invited Haman and she exposed him at the party. Bravo level wine drinking exposed him. She's like, I have receipts. He wants to kill all the Jews because he doesn't like Mordecai. He's being petty. And so the king was like, well, I can't take back an edict I already wrote. So I'm going to write a second one. So the first edict went out and it was like, kill all the Jews. And the second edict went out and it was like, Jews, defend yourself. And that's why we think Esther is really cool because she stood up for herself and the Jews, and her uncle and Haman was hung and killed because he was trying to pull wool over the king's eyes, which is a no no. And, chapter 10 is all about Mordecai, even though Esther was the one doing all the things.
Yeah. So if you want, a little more in-depth talk about Esther, you can check out episode 5 of our podcast. But no, great summary. Hopefully that gets us back in the memory of what's going on in Esther. I think for our conversation today, we're going to talk primarily about chapters 9 and 10 of Esther, kind of dive into that a little deeper than we did last time. And then we'll talk about Purim, how it's celebrated today more so. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Perfect. Okay, so Esther starts, well, I guess Esther 9 kind of starts with saying on the 13th of Adar was the day when the Jews were supposed to be massacred, but instead the Jews gathered to fight against them with the support of the officials because they were scared of Mordecai. So, this kind of not really a war because war really kind of implies two people fighting. But the Jews go out to defend themselves and they end up killing 500 people in Susa, including the evil sons of Haman. And there we are. That's like the first 10 verses. How does that feel? Questions.
I noticed in like those verses, like people seem to be very scared of Mordecai.
Yeah. 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 He's been raised to power. Like he's the king's number two man, number right hand man. So Mordecai's in power now because he's been raised up. So you're going to do what Mordecai says because if you don't do what Mordecai says, the king's going to be upset.
Okay, so he kind of just took over Haman's spot because that's what
Yeah.
Haman had been before.
Yeah. Yeah. We're saying, yeah, Mordecai, you're a cool dude. We'll do what you say.
Okay, it's giving right hand to the king.
Yeah.
Haman had his Ned Stark moment. He came into power and then was killed. And now we've transitioned.
Maybe. Yeah. Sure.
And in verses 6 through 10, there is a lot of in chapter 9, there's a lot of name dropping. Is that purposeful?
Yeah, okay. So those, let me, okay. I have my JPS Tanakh translation with me right here, not my NRSV. But what these names are is it's kind of supposed to be funny. I think these are foreign names. These aren't like what would be traditionally like Jewish names or anything like that. These are supposed to sound a little funky and weird. I think that's intentional and part of the text because, like as we mentioned in the last episode or last Esther episode, like this is kind of a funny, farcical type of book. So on Purim, when this is read, it's traditional to read all of these names in one voice or in one breath. So you read all 10 names like back to back to back to back. Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Porantha, Adalia, Ardantha, Parmashta, Arasai, Ardai, and Vaisatha. Like the idea that like these are fun, weird names. And I think that's celebrated in Purim and it's kind of in the text. I think this is supposed to be not really a fun text, but like this is it's kind of jokey in that sense, and I think this is kind of a hidden joke in there that isn't really a haha joke, but more of a huh joke.
Yeah, I was reading them out loud and I got a little breathless. I was like, oh my gosh, these are mouthfuls.
Yeah, but no, it's they're intentionally mouthfuls. I think a lot of names in the Bible are mouthfuls on their own, just because we're English speakers and it's weird words. But I think these are supposed to be kind of weird even for the Hebrew speaker.
And then in verse 10, it says they don't touch the plunder.
Yeah, this is I'm going to go on a rant here. This is going to be a detour. We're going to go out of Esther, and then you'll have to bring me back somehow.
Got
But this verbiage happens a lot, or three times in Esther, I think, in verse 17, in verse 19, maybe it happens twice more in Esther. And what I think this is referring to with yeah, I wrote an essay on this. It's not published or anything, so like there's not a ton of like scholarly work on this. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt here. But I think this is referring back to Joshua, and in Joshua, what happens there is God's like, "Hey, you guys conquered this town, but don't plunder it. Like you're not plunder it." And then some dude gets in trouble because he plundered. It's a whole big ordeal. And I think that's very intentional. And like very close to that verse, we have a king who's also hung on a pole, similar to Haman. So I think there's very intentional connections to Joshua. And then throughout Esther, we get connections back to Deuteronomy and Samuel. And there's very intentional connections back to the Deuteronomistic history, Deuteronomy through Samuel, or sorry, Deuteronomy through Kings. And I think the writer of Esther is very intentionally trying to connect this story to the Deuteronomistic history. I'm not entirely sure why, but I think what's happening is it's kind of harkened back to those days of the first kingdom, of the first temple. Like, hey, those are the good days. It can be like that again someday. Like when this is written, it's kind of like for a time of hope because the Jews are always one step away from being massacred. That's a very common thing throughout history. So to write this book to give hope in times of like, hey, we're not going to get massacred this time, and we can kind of look back to the first kingdom when like there was a lot more power and control and stability to some extent. I think that might be what's going on here, but I'm pretty sure there's a connection to the Deuteronomistic history to some extent, more so than other parts of the Bible. Like I think whoever wrote Esther is kind of focusing on that section. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. What is the significance of someone hanging on a pole?
Yeah, okay. So there's a verse in Deuteronomy. I know we talked about this earlier, I think, off the podcast. But there's a verse in Deuteronomy that says anyone hung on a pole overnight or something is cursed by God. So the idea is weird. Like this is kind of a funky thing. They're like, hey, anyone cursed on a pole on a tree. I think usually it's translated on a tree is cursed by God. The same word that you see in pole as Esther is the word for tree, etz. So um, anytime someone's cursed or hung on a tree, there's a thought going on in your head like, is that person cursed by God? Which again, another tangent when it comes to the New Testament, how you cope with Jesus being hung on a tree. For people who consider the New Testament to be scripture, how do we deal with Jesus being hung on a tree? And Paul addresses this. Like, this is a concern that was happening, and Paul's like, we need to address that. And the thing that Paul concludes is Jesus was cursed for us. So that's the Christian theology of understanding that verse and how that all works together. But you'll get much later interpretations, Jewish interpretations, that say, as kind of a polemic against Christianity, which I don't think is super helpful. But as their understandings, they say, well, just as Haman was hung on a tree, Jesus was also hung on a tree. How do we deal with that? So there's a discussion there. And I'm not going to address the answers or anything there. I'm not going to say there's an answer or anything, but this is a tension that must be held, I think. And you can try to figure it out through Paul if you're a Christian. But I think there is a definite tension here.
Wow, that's really interesting. And yet another tree.
No, trees are everywhere. Let me tell you, trees throughout the Bible and like tons of religions. Where I want from henceforth, I'm going to declare this. Henceforth, I'm just going to remind us when we see trees, because I bet we see trees a whole lot more often than we'd like to realize. Trees are everywhere. Trees. But yeah, did that make sense about the Deuteronomistic history and all that stuff?
Yes, it does. Yes, and it seems like the writer of Esther was very much influenced, pulled from those to write their own story. And
Yeah.
I'm excited to see what other things
Yeah,
might
no,
appear.
I think whoever wrote Esther is very well informed. And as we mentioned last time, like God isn't mentioned at all, but to still clearly have a connection to the past text, like implies that like this is a religious text to some extent, whatever that may mean. I think requires some extra looking into the text, but I think it's a beautifully written text, however you look at it.
So beautifully written that verses 11 through 15.
Oh yeah, Esther does her thing again. Thank you for bringing me back. Esther does her thing. She says, if it pleases the king, can we also impale the sons on the pole on the tree? And she uses that language again to be like, hey, king, do what I want. And the king, who I think we talked about simp last time, the king is a simp for Esther. He's like, of course, my Esther will do that. And then on the 14th of Adar, back in Susa, they killed 300 more people, but they did not touch the plunder, as I already ranted about.
But no plunder was touched. So king simping again.
Yeah.
And then they move on, and the edicts now start to take place.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you mean?
And I was just trying to move the conversation on because I didn't have any questions for that section.
Oh, okay.
Because you already answered the question.
The edicts already happened.
Well, no, like they're no, like the actions start to take place. Like they're carried out. Because next the people die.
Right, right.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I was alluding to. So next the edicts are carried out. I didn't have a transition sentence.
Oh, okay.
So I was
What's
coming
we're
up with
transitioning? Cool.
We're transitioning into the next part because you answered my question.
Cool. All right. So next up, we have verses 16 and 17, and it's kind of talking about what's happening in the other provinces. On the 13th of Adar, 75,000 people are killed by Jews. So then they rested on the 14th of Adar. And that's where we get Purim, because Purim is celebrated on the 14th of Adar, and we get that day because that's when they rested after they, they won this trouble.
Okay. So we've established Esther is not as historic, like what takes place in Esther is not a historical event.
Right.
There's nothing other than the writings of the book of Esther to place this as happening during this time. But Purim is based upon the events that take place in Esther.
Sure.
does that, because it didn't actually happen, does that lessen the meaning of Purim?
I mean, not necessarily, unless for some reason the only reason you would celebrate something is because it's a historical event. I I don't think it would take away the meaning from anyone. It's I mean it's in a sense telling a universal story to some extent. It's hey, there's a bad thing that was going to happen to us, but we prevailed anyways. And so I think that's kind of the story that's going, and it's using the story to kind of mention that truth that would be for Jews, like we do this in America too. Like this is how we celebrate Thanksgiving. Like it's based on the pilgrims and whatnot coming to America, but the story we tell about the first Thanksgiving, we know that the pilgrims and the Native Americans had a nice feast together. Like we know that didn't happen. We know that was a much more problematic setting than we'd like to admit and we'd like to believe. But like we still tell that story because it has some sense of meaning for us to like create thankfulness. And like we should be aware of the problematic and the how we did that poorly. But like there's still that history that we've made up that we've told that isn't necessarily based in history, but still has meaning. And that doesn't lessen it necessarily, right?
No, so true. Okay. But it's still kind of a really fun holiday, which we'll get into for the death of a lot of people,
Yeah, no, definitely.
fictional or
And
not.
right, fictional or not, but I mean the 75,000 obviously is supposed to be an exaggerated number. Like
Okay.
it's a big. It's like the point is, hey, really big things happen. So I think that's much more what it's getting across than hey, we counted 75,000 dead bodies. Like I don't think that's what's happening.
Got it.
So yeah, do we have any more thoughts on those before we move on?
Yep.
Cool. So after that, um, we kind of have some talking about what's happening. Uh, since Jews of Susa fought on the 13th and 14th, they rested on the 15th, and this is why villages and towns celebrate Purim on the 14th, and then the tradition comes that in walled cities you do it for 2 days. So in Jerusalem, even though it's not walled anymore, it's been come to accept it that you treat Jerusalem as if it's a walled city, and they kind of celebrate Purim a little bit differently, and it's a 2 day celebration in Jerusalem, whereas everywhere else it's just on the 14th of Adar. And this is when I mentioned Adar, this is the Hebrew calendar. So this happens usually February, March type area, early March.
And it's celebrated sundown on the 13th.
Yeah, yeah. So remember back in Genesis, there
Mm.
was evening and then there was morning. The day starts at sundown and then it ends at sundown. So that's how it's different. It doesn't start at 12 a.m. That's how days are a little bit different,
Okay,
or
so
they're conceived a little different because we just arbitrarily say 12 o'clock is the new day. So when you celebrate these holidays, the day starts and stops at sundown.
so celebration starts sundown on the 13th and ends sundown on the 14th, unless you're in a walled city. Then it ends sundown on the 15th.
Yeah. After that, we get a kind of an explanation for how we get the word Purim for the holiday, and those verses kind of establish it set as a holiday. So Pur literally means lots. I think it's an Akkadian loan word, but it literally means lots, and it references the lots that Haman cast to say, okay, we're gonna we're gonna massacre Jews on the 14th of Adar. So that's where we kind of get the name for. And then we get traditions from the holiday setup of giving food to the poor or giving money to the poor, giving food to friends and stuff. And we kind of get that kind of written out here. Is that track?
Yep. Oh, wait. So it's not just a celebration. They also do good acts.
Yeah, yeah. As with most holidays, like there's something that you do with it. Um, and everyone celebrates holidays like slightly different. Like going back to Thanksgiving, sometimes you just have a feast with your family and stuff. Sometimes you play football. Sometimes you go to a food pantry and you create meals for people. Like with most holidays, there's usually something more than just you know, eating food with people, though it's a main part of a lot of holidays.
And it seems like they're really like laying out what you're supposed to be doing
Mm.
for the holiday. Is that normal?
Yeah, I mean, Esther kind of acts as an ideology of sorts, I guess, of like, hey, this is why we celebrate this holiday, and it's kind of laid out here. But a lot of other holidays, to greater or lesser extents, are also laid out. Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, like they all have biblical origins, and it's kind of laid out how you celebrate them when you celebrate them in other texts of the Bible. So, like, no, this isn't necessarily unique. It's somewhat unique in that we have an entire book dedicated for it. But I don't think that's unique per se.
Okay.
After that, we get the end of chapter 9, right? We get Esther and Mordecai writing a second letter saying, "Hey, this is Purim." And what's notable here is, let's see how it's written. Uh, Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, wrote a second letter of Purim for the purpose of confirming with full authority the aforementioned one of Mordecai the Jew. So what's notable here is I could be wrong. I could be wrong and I could be forgetting something, but I think this is the only instance we really have of a woman writing something in the Bible. And this is, I could be wrong. There could be something like really obvious that I'm forgetting. I don't know. But this has been interpreted throughout the years that Esther can be like written by a woman. Like most time to be a uh, a kosher scroll to follow the rules, it's written by a man. But Esther is one of the few scrolls that's like, oh, it's okay if it's written by a woman. I think it's really unique because we have Esther writing this out as well. So, and there's some manuscripts, I forget, it could be modern, it could be old, I don't remember, but they're kind of like signed at the very end, like, and one of them is written while breastfeeding my child. So like there's the way these manuscripts are used, I think is fascinating. We could have a whole episode on like Esther manuscripts because I think that's just so fascinating. But yeah, we have here where notably Esther is part of the writing of the scroll.
That's so slay. Written while breastfeeding my child.
Yeah.
Like she was working hard. I'm kind of just absorbing it because that's really interesting because I didn't realize that in order for something to be kosher, it has to be written by a man.
To be like read in synagogues and like ritually per se. But yeah,
Yeah, and I have my own hangups with that for other reasons.
sure.
Um, but no, that's interesting, and that makes me love the story of Esther more to know
Mm,
that it's cool if it's written by a woman. Like
yeah,
it's chill, it's all right. Because I'm just thinking of other Old Testament books like Ruth. Like, could that also be written by a woman? It has a woman's name.
yeah. I don't know. I don't know enough about that to speak authoritatively. I can speak on Esther, but I don't know about those, or I don't know any of the like specific rules at all. Without speculating a bit.
Does it make you wonder, like, maybe how the views would change on some of the books in the Bible, like if they had been written by women, like or translated by women earlier
Yeah,
than maybe more modern times?
yeah. Well, I forget her name, but she translated the Odyssey, I think. And she was the first woman to translate the Odyssey, and she realized there was so much sexist language that was kind of being inserted into the text that was just kind of assumed because it was a man who translated it all previously. So yeah, definitely how scrolls are written and who has the authority to interpret and translate them is so influential to texts. Um, and then just how scrolls are presented, how they're held. There's so much with material culture that and then that you remember that it's humans writing these texts that write these scrolls, like how that is imparted on. I think it's just fascinating. I think it's slightly off topic, but no, it's great. I love it.
So then we are in chapter 10,
Yeah,
which in the
chapter
book of
10.
Esther is all about Mordecai.
yeah, a very short chapter, 3 verses long, kind of close it out. Where essentially we're like, hey, remember this Mordecai guy? He's still in power. Whoopee! Yay! And it just kind of closes it out there, which is unique because it's the book of Esther, but the book opens with Mordecai. Well, the book opens with Vashti and that story, but then we're introduced to Mordecai, and then after we're introduced to Mordecai, we're introduced to Esther, and then likewise the book ends with Mordecai. And the first time we have a reference to Purim outside of Esther is in, I want to say, Second Maccabees, and it calls it the Feast of Mordecai. So like historically, like there's contention between, is this the book of Esther or is this the book of Mordecai? And throughout history, it's ended up we end up referring to it as the book of Esther. But like thinking about this as a text, like the fact that it starts and ends with Mordecai, like and Mordecai is just as big, if not a bigger player in the story as Esther, like adds the question of when did this become the book of Esther, and why is it the book of Esther instead of the book of Mordecai?
Oh, so you want to fight. So
Well,
you want
no,
to fight. Esther
I'm
did
a
all of
big
the heavy lifting.
I'm a big fan of it being called the book of Esther, but the
Yeah,
question
yeah,
of why is it the book of Esther, I think is worth asking.
because she put in the work, because she was a queen fighting for her people. You
Yeah.
know, Mordecai wasn't going into the king's chambers, but I guess Esther was the one who made the king a simp. So I think it was a dual effort. So it's the book of Esther. Mordecai can have the last chapter. I won't be as salty about it, but it
Yeah.
would have been off with her head. She would have gone the way of Anne Boleyn.
Yeah. Yeah. And, before we move on, Esther, her original name is Hadassah, which means myrtle, a tree. Just wanted to put that in there before we moved on to Purim. We could talk about that with with the closing of this chapter.
I'm sorry to all the myrtles of the world, but I just Esther hits different. It really
Yeah.
does. Like Esther is winning the pageant. Myrtle could win.
Well, it is a translation. It's Hadassah,
I
I
know.
think.
I know.
Yeah.
Hadassah's definitely winning.
Okay,
Hadassah is
cool.
taking that crown.
Yeah.
That is a gorgeous name. I want to see more Hadassahs in the world.
Yeah. But yeah, do you have any other thoughts on I mean, we did these just 2 chapters.
Chapter
Do you have
10.
any other thoughts?
I mean, I'm like looking over this again, trying to see if there's anything. So here's what we know about Purim so far, based on what we've talked about. Starts sundown on the 13th, goes until sundown on the 14th, and
Mm.
then they roasted on the 15th because it's a lot of work killing people. And
In Susa, in the walled city of Susa.
in the walled city of Susa. And then we we give to our friends food, we give money to the needy. I believe there was a mention of drinking.
Yeah, drinking's a big part of this. Um, you're gonna send me off on another tangent here, but
Yeah, yeah.
here we are. So the Book of Esther, all the feasts that we see, I think all of them. I could be wrong. There might be 1 or 2 that aren't mentioned as such, but they're all drinking feasts. These are all frat parties. I think we mentioned that last time. These are all frat parties. It's just a bunch of drinking going on. So, uh, anytime you read about Esther, someone's going to quote this from uh, the Megillah tractate. Uh, let's go into rabbinic literature. That'll be fun. I don't think we've gone into the Talmud yet, have we?
No.
Maybe talking about Adam and Eve, I might have mentioned something, but we're gonna kind of dive into some Talmud here. And Megillah Tractate 7b-7 says, Rava said, a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until he is so intoxicated that he does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordecai. And um, that ending there, that you won't be able to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordecai. like anytime I've read anything about Purim or Esther, like they bring that up because it's a fun little tidbit, and it's like drink until you get confused because it's a celebration. Like we're doing this big celebration, and it's often like explained as like, hey, just get drunk. Purim is where we like turn things upside down, and it's really good to see things different. And we see that wine plays a predominant role in the Book of Esther. So that's generally how it's explained and understood. Does that track so far? We good there?
Are we good there? I want to be invited. I'm sorry. We're drinking with a goal. I love those. That's why I play beer pong. Like, you'll find me playing the best party games, and this sounds like a game that just happens all the party long.
Yeah, sure. Oh, I think we party very differently, but I think that's fine.
Listen, I'm not saying I party often, but if you're inviting me, this is a party with a goal. This is a party where they're trying to achieve something. They don't want to be able to tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordecai. Like
Right.
there's a religious reason. I must respect and honor that.
Sure, sure. But I wanna dive into a very interesting um some interesting thoughts that I saw on this that I think are worth bringing up to an extent. So in Tractate Yoma, it says that Rava claims that wine and good sense make me wise. So like and I forget, I should quote them. I don't remember who this is, who I'm basing this off of. But basically, what he did is say, what does Rava have to say about wine and Mordecai and Haman and all those things? See if we can like flesh out what he really means by um, get so drunk that you can't tell the difference between blessed is sorry, cursed cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. Maybe I've already had too much to drink. um, so he looks at his thoughts there and he thinks, okay, maybe Rava is saying that like, okay, you drink wine so you can make good decisions, become wise. And then other places we see Rava speaking very poorly of Mordecai, kind of putting him on equal footing with Haman, saying that Mordecai was kicked out of Israel and claiming that we just really, really hate Haman. And it's just that Haman wasn't as bad as Haman. So, or that Mordecai wasn't as bad as Haman. So that's kind of why we're like chill with him. And and this is how the Talmud works. It takes verses from from the Bible and it says, okay, let's try to make sense of this. What's the backstory? Like that's the large part of what rabbinic literature does. It's like asking questions that don't necessarily have to make sense, but it says, okay, well, what if that actually happened? And they kind of think through the biblical text and reimagine the biblical text through that different new lens. And it's really fun. Like if you ever read the Talmud or anything like that, it's really confusing, but it's a lot of fun, and you get some fun stories in there. But later we see that Rava claims it would have been good for Haman's ancestors to have been killed, which everyone's like, yeah, that makes sense. We hate Haman. But then Rava also says it would have been good for Mordecai's ancestors to have also been killed. And that's where we're like, but we like Mordecai. Mordecai's a cool guy. So what I think Rava is doing is saying that like we put Mordecai up on this pedestal of like he's this great guy because it makes sense on the text. Like you read the text and you're like, okay, Mordecai's freaking great. But if we, get drunk, if we drink until we can't tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai, what he's really saying is that we should really question what is good and what is evil. If Esther in Purim is the story of reversals and figuring these things out, it shouldn't just be this black and white picture of this is good, this is bad. We should really question our own assumptions, question our own, initial thoughts, and be like, what is actually going on here? So I think that's a much more interesting way to think about that verse, not just drink and have a party. I think that's definitely part of it, but I think when you hear, drink so much that you can't tell the difference between blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman, that what we should really be thinking is let's question our initial judgments and try to figure out what's actually good and what's actually evil. I think that's a little more profound and a little more interesting.
Definitely. Yeah, no. Question your most basic assumptions. I mean, I still think drinking can be a part of that because I don't know if you've ever gotten a little bit tipsy and gotten introspective and been like, well, why is this way and this thing the other way?
Mm-hmm.
No, that tracks. That makes sense.
So yeah, and I think there's a lot more to it, but the idea that um, that what's good and what's bad may not be
Mm.
as obvious as it seems, I think is great.
Yeah.
And maybe alcohol will help with that. Maybe you should try to do it sober also. But for sure, I think that's a fun interpretation that is worth bringing up because it's fun and exciting.
No, I definitely advocate for doing these things sober.
Yeah.
Cabernet does in fact lubricate the wheel stuff. So okay, we've kind of learned about Purim, and I'm going to be saying it in so many different ways until I feel like I've said it correctly. Um, how do we celebrate? How do people celebrate it modernly? Like,
Right. So right. So there's usually four mitzvahs or commandments that will happen, and that's kind of like how you celebrate Purim. Like these are the things that you do. And this is in Megillah, not Megillah, and Purim is is kind of celebrated communally. It's not usually, from my understanding at least, it's not usually like a small intimate ceremony or anything like that. It's kind of like you meet up with your community and you have this big old party and celebration. So usually you'll read the Megillah, or like the big thing is you read the Megillah or Esther. Esther is sometimes called Megillah. Uh, so you read the book of Esther, and usually whenever Haman's name is brought up, you'll spin some groggers, which are like noisemakers, and like blot out his name, make noise. So anytime Haman's name is said, so it's this very like performative and fun reading of Esther. And then you'll give money to those in need. It's usually said at least two. You'll give friend or food and snacks to friends, usually at least two. And then you'll have a Purim feast, which is often full of alcohol, as we've mentioned previously. So those are like the kind of main things. Read Megillah, give money to the poor, give food to friends, have a big old party.
and these four mitzvahs were all laid out in the text and have just kind of evolved throughout the years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know if reading the Megillah was that in the text.
Oh no,
Kind
no,
of to an extent, like, hey, well, yeah, because Mordecai like sent out the edicts and said, like, hey, read this. So like, yeah, yeah. But no, it's all in there to some extent.
and then
But like it's this very carnival-esque festival. Like people dress up in costumes. Sometimes it's called like a Jewish Halloween, and you'll have like uh, jesters dressed up as like rabbis, and it's this big celebration, and it's fun and carnival-esque and exciting and all that.
is it harmful at all to compare it to Halloween? And would it be harmful to put them to like other religious holidays to like help people kind of understand what it is?
I don't think so. Many, I've heard many people compare it to like say it's the Jewish Halloween. I don't think that's necessarily harmful to say that. I mean, to some extent, like to say to make a one-to-one comparison would be wrong. But if you want to introduce someone to the holiday and say, okay, it's kind of like Jewish Halloween. This is how it's different. This is what we do differently. This is the importance of it and all that. I think that's a big part of it. I think if we just did this episode and say, hey, what's Purim? Oh, it's Jewish Halloween. We get off the microphones. I think that would be a problem. Uh, but like, no, it's a starting point, and as long as we don't end at that starting point, I think it's perfectly fine.
And is it still a religious holiday if the text didn't mention God?
I mean, Buddhists have religious holidays and they don't really have a God. Like I don't think God being invoked necessarily makes something religious or
So true, Rusty. Okay.
not.
Okay.
Right?
Now, Is any costume on the table? Am I able to dress up as anything?
As far as I know, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's some thoughts out there, but I think so. So Purim's been around for forever, but the idea of dressing up as costumes, I think, goes back to about the 15th century in Europe, where it was very common for like carnivalesque festivals and stuff like that. They kind of pulled from that. So you'd be getting your fools and your jesters and like your masquerades and all those fun things. And I think that's kind of where the dressing up is in costumes came from. So there's probably guidelines, but nothing comes to mind that I know of, at least.
And it kind of aids the topsy-turviness of the
Yeah,
holiday.
no, definitely. That's definitely a part of it. Like we're turning things upside down. We're doing wild stuff. Like it's definitely a bonus part of it.
And going back to blotting out Haman's name, correct me if I'm wrong. Does that
Hmm.
also have something to do with Amalek? Is that how you say that?
Hmm. Yeah, the Amalekites. So
Um,
Haman is an Amalekite, and we get that back in chapter 1 or 2 or something. And I think this is referring to Deuteronomy. My gut says Deuteronomy 25:19. I don't know why my gut says that. It could be very wrong. Um, but it refers back to Deuteronomy, which says you'll remember to blot out all the names of Amalek. And so that's kind of what we're doing there. We're saying anytime Haman, who's this evil character, blotting out his name as this kind of celebration of like, hey, we beat this horrible guy that tried to kill us. Woo!
okay. And this holiday, so they read the Megillah.
Yeah.
And based on some videos I watched, it seems like a very interactive experience,
Mm-hmm.
like between blotting out Haman's name, but there, I, you've told me that there are different ways people reenact Esther. Like they put their own spin on it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's separate from the rereading of the Megillah.
Okay.
So you read the Megillah, and like that's the whole thing, and you say "Boo, Haman" anytime that happens. And then there's often, not always, like this isn't like it must do anything, but it's called a Purim spiel, which is a kind of a reenactment, a story, usually fun. It's like a play. You put on a play to kind of like retell this story, and you can be really creative with it. A few years ago, when the Barbie movie came out, there were like a lot of Barbie themed perm spiels where they like use Barbie characters and stuff like that to kind of address the story and retell the story in a fun way. I've seen Harry Potter ones. It was called, or I haven't seen it, but I like read about it. Called Morty Potter, uh, Mordecai instead of Harry, Morty Potter and the Philosopher's Bagel, because we're very much celebrating Jewishness, and bagels are usually identified as a Jewish food. It's like it's this uh, play to like have fun. It's this big party, and we're having fun with it.
That's amazing. And so it's really cool to see just such unique takes, I guess, on the perm spiel and just this really embodying what I guess is the purpose of the holiday, which is to celebrate being Jewish and
Yeah,
not dying.
yeah. No, there's um I don't remember who told me, but like they said the point of a Jewish holiday is some oh gosh, I'm gonna mess it up, but it's like they tried to kill us, we didn't die, let's eat. And you can get that general theme for a lot of major Jewish holidays, and that's definitely true with Purim.
So they read the Megillah, they do maybe do the Purim spiel, they have the feast, they give food to their friends, they do good deeds. I need to know a little bit more about the feast. Is there any like specific foods?
Yeah, so remember Esther, it's they're always drinking feasts. So usually it's wine associated with wine, and then you'll have food and stuff. For Purim, the only thing I can think of, maybe there's more, is going to be Hamantaschen. Hamantaschen. I have it here for my audio listeners on YouTube. You can check out my Hamantaschen. And it's this triangle-shaped cookie, usually with a fruit filling in it, apricot, raspberry, whatever. Sometimes there's chocolate filling, and it's these triangle-shaped cookies, and they're delicious. Love them, fantastic. Uh, and they're triangle-shaped. So anytime you see art depicting Esther, you can usually figure out who Haman is because he has a triangle-shaped hat on. And you say, "Oh, that's Haman. He's got the triangle-shaped hat." And then we have the Hamantaschen. I think I could be wrong here, but I think it literally translates to Haman pockets or something like that because you have like little pockets of jelly. But they're like little triangle cookies and they're delicious.
Now, those are so cute.
Yeah,
Why
they're
are they adorable?
and they're difficult to make. Like I've never made them because I'm no chef, but they're like fairly intensive. Like not like the most intensive, but they're not like chocolate chip cookies that you can just bake up. But they're really good. I really like them.
Those are cute.
Love a good
So,
cookie.
this is an Old Testament story. It
Yeah,
is laid out in the Bible. Why don't Christians celebrate it?
good question. And I think and I'll speculate here. I think there's two reasons. One that kind of makes sense, and one that's a little sad. So we'll start with the one that kind of makes sense. So for Christians, Jesus comes along and Jesus fulfills the law, whatever that means. We can talk about that at some other point. But Jesus comes to fulfill the law. And what that means to Christians is what happened in the Old Testament, they don't really need to do anymore. Jesus kind of did that for them, and they can move on to do these new things that Jesus commands them to do. So, Old Testament laws, Old Testament traditions, Old Testament holidays, stuff like that, that's not necessary for Christians to do anymore. So, that's that on paper, I think that very briefly, like there's more to it for sure, but like to very briefly get that point across, I think on paper that's why. I think more realistically, what happened is Christians looked at these holidays and they said, "That's a little too Jewish." And I think the reason that these holidays aren't celebrated are probably baked to some extent in anti-Semitism, and like especially like think of Reformation. We talk about this with our Lent episode. Martin Luther, famously anti-Semitic, trying to distance himself from Judaism, and it's very common. Like we even get this in some of the New Testament writings, a very distinct attempt to distance themselves from Judaism. So I think there's a part of that, and we even see this like when we talk about Lent with different versions of Christianity. A lot of Protestants, I think, don't celebrate Lent because that would make them too Catholic, and they really want to step away from Catholicism. And that's probably what's happening here too. But instead of stepping away from a different denomination within your religion, where Christians are trying to step away from a different religion. Speculating here, I could be wrong. People feel free to disagree with me on that one, but I think those are the two main reasons.
That's a bummer because after doing so much research and reading and watching videos of Purim celebrations, I really won't go.
Yeah.
Guys, this is my official plea. Please invite Jodie to a Purim celebration next year because I just think I really want to appreciate this. It seems like such a beautiful community gathering to celebrate the overcoming of so many obstacles. And when you and I were kind of outlining this episode, you reminded me that they still celebrated Jewish holidays during the Holocaust
Mhm.
in the camps. Like it probably looked very different. And
Yeah.
to have these traditions that are so old, that are so steeped, even though it wasn't a historical event, it is still steeped in history
Yeah.
in how they have remained tight, close-knit communities. I think this is just such a beautiful thing that I I feel blessed to have learned about.
Yeah. No, it's fun. Love a good holiday. If you want to learn about new religions, it's and you're like completely unfamiliar with it, one of the best starting points is to look at their holidays. say what are their main holidays they celebrate, why, what are they called, and all those things. And it's really it's a good way to learn about what's important to these religions. And I think that's why we talked about Lent last week because that's such a big holiday in Christianity. And Purim by no means is the biggest holiday in Judaism, but it's still a fairly important holiday. And I think if you want to learn about new religions, a good place to start is holidays for sure.
Well, that's all I've got. Anything else?
Perfect. I think that's all I can think of. Um, yeah, if you have any questions or thoughts about what we talked about this episode, feel free to reach out to us on email or social media. We're on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter or X, Bluesky, YouTube. We're on YouTube, and then listen to us on like your Spotify's and Apple's and wherever you get podcasts. I think that's all I mentioned. That's all our
Yeah,
socials.
email us. Matthew mentioned the email first this time. He's desperate for it,
I
guys.
would love an email like from someone just being like, dude, I think you're dumb. I would love to be called dumb via email. That'd be so much fun. But no, please reach out to us, ask questions about this episode or things you want us to talk about in the future, whatever. Right?
And if you found this episode interesting and you wanted to hear a little bit more about Esther, check out our episode on Esther. I like
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, it was
Love the
great. Perfect.
frat
Well,
comparisons.
thanks everyone. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.
I'm going to try to make Hamantaschen.
I mean, they're fun. I think the thing that scares me is you have to put a filling in it. And I think that scares me. Pies, I think I love pies, love eating good pie, but it's kind of like chicken. I feel like I need to overcook chicken for it to be safe for me to eat. And then the fact that I cook something and I put it in an oven and it comes out still kind of liquidy, I think that
Mm.
scares me. I don't trust myself with it.
Like, how is the crust? Is the crust like a flaky? Is it
Yeah,
doughy?
well,
Like,
I mean, I don't haven't had a ton, but like this one's kind of moist-ish, like not super moist or but it's like hard, but like kind of moist.
and how deep in there is the filling? Is the filling just like plopped on top, or is it a little bit in between?
A little bit in between, but it's not like a ton.
Okay. I
But it's
mean,
great. And you can use whatever your favorite preserves or whatever are.
I'm making chocolate. I'm not making anything with fruit. Don't even play with me like that.
I've never had a chocolate one, but all the fruit ones I've had are great.
All the videos I saw said that poppy seed were the best, but I'm
I
not a poppy seed person.
don't think I've had a poppy seed one either.